Good afternoon, and welcome to this special course on the 2020 presidential election. For those of you who are new, my name is Joel Carcieri, and I am a member of the Political Science Department. Today, the 8th week of our panel sessions will be on the topic of inequality in America and civil liberties. But before we get to our speakers this afternoon, I want to alert all of the enrolled students that I have sent an email regarding the first quiz and the second quiz in this course. If you have not received that email for one reason or another, please write to me and I will fill you in. If you have received the email and you have questions, don't hesitate to write me, and I will be glad to clarify any of the issues regarding how we're going to proceed to earn a credit grade. Let me just make it clear that this course is a credit, no credit course, so everyone is seeking a credit grade, and there will not be letter grades in the course. With that, let me turn to today's important topic. The stimulus for this week's topic was the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May and the resulting protests throughout America regarding the activities of police departments and minority groups. I wasn't sure whether or not this topic was appropriate for the presidential election at first, but then I thought that given the importance of what has happened in America in the last 3 months, that we couldn't have a presidential election course in 2020 and not have some words trying to clarify and maybe even recommend ways to respond to civil liberties and inequalities in America at this time. So as always, I want to thank the participants generally for agreeing to share their ideas about this topic with us this afternoon. And our first speaker will be Professor Ronald Hayduck of the Department of Political Science. Ron's research focuses on political participation, social movements, and immigration. Professor Hayduck received his PhD from the City University of New York Graduate Center, and he teaches courses on inequality and political engagement. Ron, the floor is yours.
Hello there. Thank you so much, Professor Carcieri, for having me. I think this is a very important discussion, and I'm delighted and honored to join my esteemed colleagues. Before I present data on the various dimensions of economic and social inequality, let me point to a political puzzle posed by Betsy Hodges, the former mayor of Minneapolis, where George Floyd was brutally murdered. A puzzle I think deserves studied consideration because it has important implications for evaluating public policy options facing voters in this election and beyond. Hodges notes that although liberal Democrats have led most cities for the past half century, the gaps in socioeconomic outcomes between whites and blacks are worst in the richest, bluest cities. Hodges asks, how could this be? The protests have again led many people to scratch their heads, including mine that's losing some hair, and to try to wonder again about how it is that our schools and neighborhoods remain largely racially segregated decades after the civil rights movement, the end of de jure segregation, and 8 years of a Black president. How do we understand this? Hodges' answer in brief is that white neighborhoods continue to hoard advantages and block policy that would achieve progress. For example, she observed as mayor that liberals funded a rental assistance hotline, but they blocked reform to zoning laws that would have created more affordable housing and promoted racial integration. And these same representatives blocked meaningful reform to policing. The consequences of such policy choices form the harsh reality of Black life in America today, where on nearly every indicator of well-being, African Americans as a group score lower on average than do whites and other groups. Here's a chart showing median household income by race during the past few decades. African Americans' income, depicted by the brown line at the bottom, remains the lowest of all social groups, and only about half the yearly income as whites, represented on the top line. Wealth is even more highly skewed. Here you can see the net worth of white households, which is about 10 times greater than Black households. And despite the growth of a small Black middle class, the rise of Black CEOs, entertainers, sports players, and elected officials, the sad truth is that inequalities and segregation have actually grown worse in recent years, as these charts show. And the chart on the right shows the intersection of racial and gender dimensions of economic hardship. Today, income and wealth inequality in America have reached new heights, prompting some to dub our current period as a new Gilded Age, where the top tier garner a disproportionate amount of income and wealth generated by our economy compared to the vast majority of the US population. Think about it. Today, just 3 white men own more wealth than the bottom half of the population. And the richest 400 people in the United States today are worth $3.2 trillion, more than 2/3 of the population. Of course, the pandemic has only exacerbated these disparities, with billionaires seeing their combined wealth increase by a staggering $821 billion since March, while Black and brown people die and have lost jobs at higher rates than whites, as these charts show. So this question, how do we understand these inequalities and what policy options might begin to address them? Although social scientists debate why such disparities exist, for a long time this debate's been happening, and they point to various factors, highlighting and emphasizing different ways to examine and try to understand these disparities. There's a growing body of research that points to an inescapable answer, I would submit, rooted in our violent origins, America's violent origins, beginning with the theft of Native American lands and the importation and subjugation of slaves, to the conquest of Mexican lands here in the West and the exploitation of Chinese and other immigrants, to the decades of Jim Crow segregation, all of which have sort of combined to a steady stream, if you will, of discriminatory public policies and private practices that have combined to shape America's unequal economic and social development in ways that persist into our time today. There's a lot of scholarship to help us understand this history, including a terrific film I really recommend you all check out if you haven't already. It's called Race, the Power of an Illusion. There's also the New York Times 1619 Project, among other works cited here, which show how race was created and how racism was woven into our political economy and social structures from early on, and most importantly, how racism continues to operate today. Although studies show most whites do not have racial animus and do not act in intentionally biased ways, whites nevertheless regularly access a broad range of material privileges without doing anything consciously, which is something that I learned about my own family's history and during the course of my own life. For example, federal and state governments distributed Native American and Mexican lands to European settlers, built transportation corridors that developed the West, enacted government housing policies that promoted redlining and shaped racialized housing markets, patterns of suburbanization, and subsequent wealth creation, all of which, of course, were denied to Black and brown people who were relegated to inferior jobs, housing, schools, in ways that limited their wealth creation. These developments, in turn, shaped racial identities and subsequent patterns of privilege and disadvantage. These parts of America's history are not pretty, but they do shed light on how we got here, and they have important implications for public policy choices facing the nation in this election and beyond. Indeed, if Reconstruction had been allowed to proceed after the Civil War, it could have dismantled the slave system and built a different America. Similarly, the civil rights and Black power movements of the 1960s were largely turned back by conservative counter-revolutions, which, it must be said, included some Democrats, and not only those in the South. After all, it was Bill Clinton who helped to form the Democratic Leadership Council in 1985 to move the party away from the leftward turn that it took in the 1960s and 70s. And Clinton signed the harsh incarceration legislation that sent millions of mostly Black and brown men to jail, ended welfare as we knew it, and helped deregulate Wall Street. And yes, Joe Biden supported such policies, blocked busing that would have integrated schools, and more. In short, systematic racism and neoliberalism have been bipartisan affairs. The main point here is that in order to understand the current patterns, we need to connect these dots, and we need to get serious about enacting policies that undo this legacy. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun said, in order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way. Martin Luther King Jr. is regularly celebrated by liberals and conservatives, but his message is often whitewashed, shorn of its more radical elements. Officials frequently quote King's "I Have a Dream" speech, where he calls for a world where people are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That speech has been used to justify colorblind policies, which in the abstract are consistent with notions of equality before the law, but in practice actually undermine the thrust of King's message and the policies he and the civil rights movement sought to achieve. Race-neutral policy after 400 years of Black deprivation and the subsidizing of white wealth accumulation may feel good to whites, but it doesn't address past injustices, nor does it rectify current inequalities to create a level playing field for equal competition. To illustrate this point, the image on the left depicts how race-neutral policy works. It gives everyone the same size box, but giving everyone the same size box only replicates pre-existing inequalities. Rather, it is only by providing a proportional remedy that everyone can truly participate in the game of life equally, as the box on the right shows. It's like playing the game of Monopoly, but instead of everyone starting with the same amount of money as the rules of the game require, some players begin with lots of money and others begin with no money or even in debt. But that's how colorblind policy works. It suggests the rules of the game are fair and that everyone has an equal chance to win, but the facts tell a different story. The wealth generated by growing US economy largely ended up in the hands of whites and suburban residents, not just because they worked harder, as the bootstrap myth goes, or notions of merit, but also because such preconditions gave them a head start. Their children entered good schools, had a relatively debt-free college experience, accessed gainful employment, and thereby continued the intergenerational transfer of wealth and privilege to their offspring, and the mal-distributed rewards and disadvantage on display today. The main point here, I hope I'm getting through, is unless we change the structures and processes that perpetuate inequality, greater equity will remain elusive. The good news is the United States has used policy tools in the past to reduce economic inequality, tools that provide valuable lessons and remain viable today. New Deal policies, for example, produced a relatively egalitarian income distribution during the decades following World War II, as the chart on the left shows, when many working class ethnics moved into the middle class as the middle class expanded, even while Blacks and other people of color were largely locked out of such gains via discriminatory housing and education policy, provisions in the Social Security Act, and other programs. By contrast, the last 40 years, as the chart on the right shows, the top 5% of households saw their incomes increase by 75%, while the lowest income groups saw no gain. Tax policy was instrumental and has been instrumental in producing these changes, among other factors. Americans are surprised to learn that we had historically a very steep progressive income tax, as high as 90%, 94%, as the green line on the top shows. And we had relatively higher corporate tax rates as well, as the gray line shows, for most of the 20th century, or at least much of it. These higher federal and concomitant state taxes funded the building of the infrastructure that forms the terrain of our lives today, including our far-flung military bases and personnel, our interstate highway system, airports, bridges, water and sewage system, housing and public schools, all of which could use an upgrade, including the CSUs that used to have, be tuition free, by the way. During the post-war period, when the economy doubled in size and wealth, the income it generated was more evenly distributed, as measured by the blue Gini coefficient line. And yes, we still had millionaires, but not billionaires, and far fewer of both. But during the 1980s, President Reagan and a democratically controlled Congress slashed taxes and scaled back or eliminated many anti-poverty programs, which contributed to increases in inequality. A second major factor I'd like to point to is the rise and fall of labor unions, which profoundly shaped the lives of millions of workers and their families, for better, when about 1/3 of all workers were in labor unions in the middle of the century, and then for worse, as labor union membership declined to about 10%, which is what it is today, which tracks to changes in income inequality. Comparative analysis also shows the distinctive nature of inequality in the United States. Although other wealthy countries were similarly exposed to the forces of globalization, automation, changes in technology and communications, the United States stands out as a clear outlier. In short, regimes that embraced neoliberal policies saw the steepest increases in inequality, with the US at the top. So the lessons are clear. There are policies that have and can reduce economic and social inequality. We know that they can work, and they have important implications for, again, for choices that voters face in this election and beyond. During the last minutes that I have left, let me contrast briefly the candidates' position on such policies. Biden proposes raising the corporate tax back to 28%. He would raise income taxes on the rich top 5% of households that make more than $400,000 a year in income. Biden proposes a $775 billion expansion of childcare, a $2 trillion climate agenda, a $15 minimum wage, policies that would increase labor union expansion, a plan to boost manufacturing, agricultural jobs, and to bring broadband to every household. His racial equity plan would fund minority and women-owned businesses. His housing plan would support new construction and first-time home buyers, as well as public housing, and the elimination of housing regulations that perpetuate discrimination. Biden would provide relief from student debt, make public universities tuition-free for families with incomes under $125,000 a year, which would cover about 90% of Black, Latino, and Native American households. Trump and the GOP have enacted a $1.5 trillion tax cut that largely went to corporations, banks, and the wealthy, along with a series of executive orders and, of course, the bipartisan COVID packages. Trump maintains he's done more than anyone for working people and the Black community, citing a low unemployment rate prior to COVID, but a closer look at his record reveals his administration has rolled back rules and issued new ones that eliminate protections and opportunities for many workers and people of color, as these items listed here on the slide indicate. There's much more we could say about each candidate and their party's positions, but I know time is ticking and my colleagues are waiting, but the best is yet to come, you know. Let me end with saying that, you know, you all are living through a period of that's marked by mass popular mobilization on both the left and the right, where during the last 3 years, an estimated 30 million people have marched. I mean, just think about it, the largest mass movement this summer that happened during a pandemic. And thousands of others have lobbied officials and launched new organizations over these years. Hundreds of new candidates have run for office, from Congress to school boards. Like other periods of popular mobilization, young people and people of color are at the forefront of these mobilizations, along with women and queer folks, who have injected issues into the political debate and comprise a large and growing share of the voting age and eligible population. So what's the point here? If these folks, you folks in this class, all of us, if they vote in sizable number in this election and stay active, gotta stay active in public affairs going forward, not just in elections, we might see greater equity in America and in our futures. So I hope these comments have been useful for your deliberations. Thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ron. I think your slides and narrative convey the multidimensionality of inequality. And I wanted to say that time did not permit for us to go through all of the versions and manifestations of institutional inequality in the United States. So I don't want any viewer of this webinar to think that these are the only problems that exist. I do want to just comment on your last point. I hope that the webinar will address your last point about people being active in more ways than just voting. And our last session in December will be addressed on that topic exactly, on what you can do now that the election is over and how viewers of this webinar can act to improve their community. And one way to improve their community is, of course, to make it more equal and to make it more just. So thank you very much, Ron, for that extremely useful presentation. And now our second speaker is Professor Nick Conway, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science. Nick holds a PhD in political science from Texas A&M University, and he also holds a JD degree from Indiana University School of Law. His area of specialization is public law, constitutional litigation, judicial politics. And one of his recent articles appeared in Washington University Journal of Law and Policy with the title Confidence and Constraint, Public Opinion, Judicial Independence, and the Roberts Court. Nick, please take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's good to be here with all of you. I also have some slides, so I'll share those. Is everybody able to see those?
Yeah,
okay?
it's fine.
Good. Terrific. So today we're going to talk about civil liberties and police misconduct. And in particular, as Dr. Carcieri noted, the question of George Floyd and police reform is, I think, certainly a salient topic in people's minds in this election season. And so I want to talk about some of the finer points about the constitutional litigation aspects related to policing the police, if you will, and what that looks like. And when we talk about constitutional rights or civil liberties, it's important to be clear about what we mean. In particular, with regards to civil liberties, we think about the freedom from undue governmental interference with some particular activity or right that's found within the Bill of Rights. Now, many of you probably are aware of rights in the Bill of Rights. You probably have heard of freedom of speech, which is in the First Amendment, or the right to trial in criminal cases, which is the Sixth Amendment. And in situations involving police misconduct, particularly excessive force, you're talking about Fourth Amendment violations, okay? Today, I'll focus on the interaction between the police and civil liberties. And in particular, we'll have a bend, if you will, towards the Fourth Amendment and constitutional litigation related to the Fourth Amendment. But first, I want to ask this question, because I think it's an important question to ask. And I think if you can get your hands around an answer to this question, you can then begin working to solve some of the issues associated with police misconduct. And that is, why would a police officer kneel on a man's neck for 7 minutes and 46 seconds? I think if you're able to answer that question, you know something about human behavior. And if you know something about human behavior, you can then begin to use, even as Professor Haydick suggested, incentive mechanisms to effectively move people towards different types of what we may say are progressive or positive behavior. So let that question sort of percolate as we work through these materials. Now, I'm going to take an approach here on this issue, and I need to address something first called the baseline. So the Bill of Rights in general provides a baseline, okay, a baseline of protection. So imagine the Bill of Rights in the aggregate, in total, provides some baseline of protection from governmental interference, okay, at the state or the federal level. If you imagine the black line as being no rights, okay, clearly we don't have that situation in the United States. We have some rights, right? We have some baseline protection from what the government can do. And this would include things like preventing them from engaging in excessive force, right? One way to change this baseline, one way to increase the baseline, is to pass a constitutional amendment. You can pass a constitutional amendment and effectively constitutionally codify some set of rights. And we've passed constitutional amendments in this country, but they're really hard to do, right? Especially given the current situation. And so given the fact that it's really hard to pass constitutional amendments, this may not be a viable path forward for adjusting what our baseline constitutional rights are. Now, there's another way, for instance, you might move this line upward, and that would include having a court, a Supreme Court, reinterpret the meaning of these rights that are in the Constitution. So you might imagine, for instance, during the Warren Court era of the Supreme Court, where individual rights were in critique, they were found, invented. Others might say that they were realized, that were already there. The point being that there were decisions by the court that expanded individual rights during this time period, civil liberty rights and rights during this time period. If you're banking on the United States Supreme Court making a massive turn to the left in protection of individual rights, I think that you're better off going to Vegas and playing the craps table, because I don't think that the court is going to be making that movement to the left. And as you're well aware, right now there are hearings going on involving a new potential justice, Amy Coney Barrett, for the United States Supreme Court. She's very conservative. I don't expect the Supreme Court to be moving in a leftward direction anytime soon. And by anytime soon, I mean in the next couple decades, okay? So you can't use a constitutional amendment for pragmatic reasons. You can't bank on the Supreme Court for pragmatic reasons. And so you're left at that original baseline value, right? But notice something. That line here is dashed. And what that suggests is that we have constitutional rights, but they're not always enforced. They're not always realized, and people slip through the cracks. And the question then becomes, if you can't change that baseline and move it up, what can you do to fill it in? What can you do to prevent individuals from slipping through those cracks? And that's what I want to talk about today with regards to police misconduct litigation. So let me first ask this question: why do people follow the law? Well, there are lots of reasons why people may follow the law. Some may follow the law because they believe it's a moral imperative. Some may follow the law because it's embedded within their personal belief systems. But I want to propose that a theory for evaluating, which is not my idea, this is well regarded in the academic literature, that people follow the law using a cost-benefit analysis. Okay? And this assumes that rational actors are going to maximize their utility. And utility is just a vague term meaning some bundle of preferences. Okay? So let me give you an example involving speeding. Right next to campus, San Francisco State's campus, is 19th Avenue and Holloway, right? And if any of you have seen that intersection, you know that the cars go by at a fairly high rate of speed, and crossing that street is sort of like playing, and this is, I'm going to date myself, but the video game Frogger, where you have to jump across the road and not get squashed by the cars. Well, this is kind of what happens at 19th and Holloway. Now, if we wanted to ensure that nobody speeds in that area, we could do a couple things, right? We could have police there only serving that particular intersection and enforcing the speed limit restrictions. And we could also penalize people. Now, I don't know how much a traffic ticket is. I've never gotten one at 19th and Holloway, but I assume it's probably in the neighborhood of 150, 200 bucks, somewhere around there. Well, what if we made the penalty for speeding $15,000? Okay. My guess is that most people would probably take their foot off the gas pedal when they go through that intersection. Now, we may not want to do that because, well, we need police to do other things, right? Like investigate crimes. They can't just be tethered to an intersection. We may not want to penalize people that much because we consider it to be unfair. But the point is, and the example illustrates, that this cost-benefit analysis, aside from the normative judgments about where the price point should be, the cost-benefit analysis clearly demonstrates that as economic incentives change, so does human behavior. Okay? Well, so how can we apply that to something like police misconduct litigation and protection of civil liberties? Well, one very, very, very simple theory, and this is just a reduced form version of this, is that the police will violate an individual's rights if the benefit they derive from violating those rights is greater than the cost of violating that person's rights, okay? Multiplied, of course, by the probability that the cost is going to be imposed. This is just cost benefit, right? There's your cost, there's your benefit, okay? Well, same thing with thinking about speeding. Let's think about the police officer who might violate someone's rights, okay? Maybe that officer has a reward for, let's say, engaging in excessive force. All right, they detain a suspect in a way that doesn't require them to deploy a bunch of other, let's say like some of the military-esque weapons that they have that can be expensive. It allows for an arrest to occur. But of course, if they are ultimately sued or have some cost, they lose their job, something like that, then that may give them pause on their actions, okay? And through the manipulation of these probabilities and costs, you can therefore create a disincentive for officers to engage in misconduct, okay? So in terms of the constituent elements of that equation, the B's and C's, remember, this is utility theory, which means it's just a bundle of preferences, right? And as I suggested, an officer may want to engage in an unlawful action because it helps them more easily apprehend a suspect, or they gather evidence, Or maybe they're just a racist and they woke up that morning and they said, I want to do something racist today. And so here is my racist thing I'm going to do today. That gives them some utility in doing that. Now, it may not be my utility, it may not be your utility, it may not be beneficial for society in terms of the utility, but that's their personal utility in engaging in that activity, right? There could also be costs associated, as I suggested. The officer could lose their job. They might get sued for money damages if they violate someone's rights. There could even be a reduction in public trust, or even the cost of laundering that uniform, their uniform. If they chase the person, then they're going to get their uniform dirty. Then they got to get it laundered. Then that's going to cost them $5 when they go to the laundromat or whatever it is, dry cleaners. The point is utilizing these B's and C's and P's, we can try to find what a good adjustment is to our current situation, okay? All right, so how does this apply then in practical effect? Well, in terms of enforcing federal constitutional rights, okay, civil liberties under the federal Constitution, there are two primary ways that this happens. Okay? One is through the actions of the federal government, and one is through individual lawsuits. Now, it turns out that the federal government, through the Department of Justice, can investigate police misconduct of state and local authorities. And I'm putting the federal authorities off to the side for a second. The Constitution directly applies to the federal authorities, but most policing takes place at the state and local level, right? I mean, the vast majority of policing takes place at the state and local level. So the federal government could investigate. They can negotiate these consent decrees with police departments where they have to make certain changes to come into compliance with the consent decree. The consent decree can be overseen by a federal judge or magistrate judge. And in some cases, the federal government can actually prosecute individuals for engaging in criminal violations of federal constitutional rights. In fact, that's what happened in the Rodney King case, right, where the officers that were acquitted in Rodney King's in the state court proceedings against them were subsequently prosecuted for federal criminal constitutional violations. The point is that there's a mechanism at work, there's things that can be done, but there are difficulties. And that difficulty exists because first you have to have an executive branch that runs the Department of Justice that actually wants to do that kind of enforcement. It's pretty clear that the Trump administration has no interest in doing that kind of enforcement. And even Democratic predecessors have also had some hesitancy in engaging in such action. As Professor Haydick noted, one of Bill Clinton's legacies is a shift to the right with the Democratic Party. Well, the Clinton administration was not keen on many of these prosecutions and taking on local law enforcement for political reasons. So we can depend on the federal government a little, but in reality, that's not where the work is done in practical terms. The real work is done here with individual lawsuits. They are much more common than enforcement by the federal government. And in these lawsuits, individuals sue police officers for violating their constitutional rights, their civil liberties. And in our discussion involving police, most oftentimes those are lawsuits pursuant to violations of the Fourth Amendment, okay? And this allows individuals to obtain relief. They can obtain compensatory damages, which are money damages compensating for an injury. So how much did it cost to replace the broken arm that the police did to somebody? Punitive damages. If it's really egregious behavior by the police, they can be assessed punitive damages to punish them and deter others from engaging in future similar misconduct. And they might even be eligible for equitable relief, meaning an injunction, let's say, is entered stopping a police from engaging in certain activity, although that is very hard to obtain given a particular Supreme Court decision that's beyond the scope of this conversation today. Now, these individual lawsuits, if we think about the enforcement theory, have the effect of essentially increasing the cost that's imposed upon the officer if they engage in the misconduct, and also the probability that the cost will be imposed, right? If these lawsuits are brought and they are litigated and there's a consistent avenue for them, then this can serve as a deterrent against police misconduct. All right. So at this point in time, you're probably thinking, okay, great. How do we do this? Well, it turns out In all of the federal code, the United States Code, there's really one provision that's important, and that's 42 USC section 1983. This is Title 42 of the United States Code, section 1983. And this law, colloquially known as section 1983, was originally part of the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act. And it was a post-Civil War statute that was enacted that allowed anybody who was injured by someone acting under color of law to sue for a violation of their constitutional rights. Now, for many years, this statute lay dormant, but in the early 1960s, the US Supreme Court issued some rulings that effectively opened the floodgates for it. And to this actual day now, most litigation that happens, and by most, I mean like 99.9% of litigation that happens involving police departments, involves 42 USC section 1983, right? It is what's known as a cause of action, right? And here it's a federal cause of action where Congress has said, if someone acts under the color of law, meaning as an officer of the state, let's say, or a municipality, like a city or a town, and they deprive you of your constitutional rights, you can sue them, okay? Now this is great, right? So far, so good. Interpreting section 1983 broadly means, as I suggested, an increase in the cost on the officer, as well as the probability that the officer will be hit with the cost, which then impacts their decision-making, much like speeding, let's say, on 19th Avenue and Holloway, right? All right, and in fact, if we look at the George Floyd lawsuit that was filed by his estate against the city of Minneapolis, note in the second sentence of the introductory portion of the complaint, the claim is brought pursuant to 42 USC section 1983. So there we see section 1983 in action, and it's being used in the George Floyd case. All right, so we're all fine and good, right? Wrong, we're not. And here's where we got to get into the weeds just a little bit, but I think it's incredibly important for people to understand, right? Hidden in the law of section 1983 is a concept called qualified immunity. And in essence, qualified immunity works to decrease that P. So if we go back to our equation here, this number gets smaller because of qualified immunity. And if that number gets smaller, then the likelihood of the cost outweighing the benefit is reduced, meaning the officers continue their present course of behavior, okay? Qualified immunity works like this, okay? It means that if a police officer violates your constitutional rights, if the law was not clearly established at the time of that violation, they will not be held liable for damages. Now, what that means is this. It means that a police officer can actually violate the Constitution, and a court can say a police officer violated the Constitution. But if that officer was operating in a gray area where the law was not clearly established, then that officer gets a free bite at the apple, or a free punch to the stomach, or a free knee to the neck, right? Note, the concept of qualified immunity is nowhere found in 42 USC section 1983. It doesn't exist in there. It was created by the Supreme Court in a decision called Harlow versus Fitzgerald in 1982, where the Supreme Court effectively read in the common law, what it considered to be the common law immunity typically given to sheriffs in the time of kings of England, okay? So the doctrine essentially gives you a free bite at the apple, and the game then becomes, well, what is quote unquote clearly established? Now, that gamesmanship about what is or is not clearly established has ultimately led to many bites at many apples over time. And the end game is that it makes it really hard to enforce civil liberties lawsuits and enforce those rights against police officers, okay? Now, remember that George Floyd lawsuit I showed you? Look at the following words. We know it comes after 42 USC section 1983. Look at what's in George Floyd's estate's complaint. redress the deprivation under color of state law of George Floyd's clearly established rights. This was written by a very savvy attorney who knows that the police in George Floyd's case are going to claim qualified immunity as a defense. And even in a case where somebody's neck is knelt on for 7 minutes and 46 seconds, the incentive mechanism is so great for the police to argue that they are entitled to qualified immunity that it finds its way into the pleadings in this particular litigation. Right? So this is anticipating qualified immunity claims in the George Floyd case. Now, in terms of the 2020 election and Section 1983, well, it turns out that, frankly, these kinds of issues are just not that important to voters. The typical voter right now is more concerned about with COVID or not having a job or being evicted from their home than some concept of qualified immunity. It's just not on their mind. However, it is on the policymakers' minds. So for instance, during the Democratic presidential debates, Julian Castro, during one of the debates, actually called for an end to qualified immunity. Okay? Additionally, this summer, the House passed the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, which actually amends 1983 by a statute and eliminates the qualified immunity defense. Now, of course, the House is controlled by the Democrats, the Senate is controlled by the Republicans. That legislation has gone nowhere in the Senate. But the difference between, if we return to the original picture of the baseline of rights, the difference between having to move those rights upward with a constitutional amendment, let's say, and amending 1983 is that with 1983, you just have to pass a simple statute to undo this. And it turns out that if the Democrats take the presidency and they take the Senate, it has been discussed that they will bring back up the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, model it as 2021, and try to pass it at that point in time, okay? And clearly the election has import in the sense that a Biden executive branch governing the DOJ, the Department of Justice, would probably engage in more federal-based oversight of police agencies. But in any event, the key here is to understand that this election has consequences, maybe beyond the saliency of what's in the newspapers for this issue. Okay? So recall my earlier question. Why would a police officer kneel on a man's neck for 7 minutes and 46 seconds? There are likely many explanations for this, right? Psychological, which could include racist tendencies, sociological explanations, right? That might explain how police departments function or what the environment of them are like. You might even have biological. Some criminals, it turns out, actually have a biological disposition. Sometimes people engage in criminal acts because they have something wrong physically with them biologically, and that is contributing to their decision-making. But what about that law and economic analysis? In some ways, if the legal economic explanation that I've talked about here today is accurate, then I think that maybe is the most disturbing. Because what it means then is that a rational police officer might have willingly calculated that probability, or that officer might have made an estimate of the likelihood that they're going to get in trouble for engaging in some kind of misconduct. And if we want to adjust that calculation, if we want to disincentivize certain behavior, then I think it makes case for us to amend 1983, address that issue of qualified immunity, and then tinker with that probability equation or that inequality. And that's fixing, in my mind, not only the mathematical inequality displayed by that particular, those variables, associated variables, but also the human inequality that persists. So I thank you all for listening today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think for the layman who has never looked at the United States Code, explaining a section and relating it to real human behavior that the average person can understand is a really important service. So thank you very much for that. Our third speaker is Professor Angelica Camacho, who is Assistant Professor in the Criminal Justice Studies program at San Francisco State. Professor Camacho received her PhD in ethnic studies from the University of California at Riverside and her BA degree from the University of California at Santa Barbara in both Chicana and Chicano studies and Black studies. Her current research documents the Pelican Bay, California prisoner hunger strikes and the subsequent uprising of their families. Professor Camacho engages and forefronts prisoners and their families' theorization about social transformation and the carceral state. Additionally, Angelica analyzes how people have become anesthetized to the brutality of solitary confinement and points to the rise of moral panics around the Mexican mafia. She simultaneously explores how the war on drugs, gangs, and the criminalization of Latinx communities has contributed to the rise of the prison industrial complex in California. Thank you for appearing, Angelica. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Carcieri. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's really an honor to be alongside colleagues in SF State and learn from all of your work. We don't really get these opportunities, so thank you for inviting me. All right, so y'all can see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, so I was asked to come today and speak on a little bit of the efforts of the Defund the Police campaigns that have risen after the George Floyd murder, I will call it murder, and how it's linked to the elections and the conversations that are happening around the presidential debates. So some of what we've heard in regards to the criminal justice system and criminal justice reform, especially all of the uprisings that have came after the George Floyd protests, have been conversations around law and order, right? And trying to reinstitute law and order in response to what some people have called looting and riots. So just to break down a little bit in terms of what we heard in regards to the presidential debates in regards to the criminal justice reform and law and order. So if we look at the position that Donald Trump took, he's instructed federal agencies to end racial sensitivity training and training that addresses white privilege and critical race theory because he believes it is racist, that it's teaching Americans to hate our country and it's helping breed a radical revolution. He also shows strong support for law enforcement, and he accuses Biden of refusing to call for law and order because Biden is afraid of losing the support of the radical left. He blames the Democrats' reluctance to praise law and order for spikes in homicides. He believes that the National Guard should be intervening to stop protests, to stop looting and riots that have risen in response to police violence. And he believes that leftists and Antifa, not white supremacist groups, are the main purveyors of violence, that leftists need to be stopped by any means necessary in order to be able to institute the peace and bring back social order in our country. And he's asked Proud Boys to stand back and stand by because they may be the only ones that are doing anything about stopping leftist violence. So in other words, he's taken a very traditional tough on crime response. And he believes that there should be military intervention to be able to stop and quell protests. If we look at Joe Biden, he admits that there is systemic injustice in America and that there is systemic injustice in education work and in how law enforcement is enforced. Biden believes that there are decent, honorable police and law enforcement who risk their lives to take care of us. He is calling for transparency because he believes that bad apples need to be sorted out and they need to be held accountable, right? We should enact a process of transparency that does this. And he believes that one of the solutions could be to bring together civil rights leaders, police officers, and police chiefs to work this out in a meeting and just let police officers deal with the problems that they're facing. He's also calling for what some people term community policing, right? So having police officers be more involved with the police and maybe receive different types of training where they can be accompanied by psychologists and psychiatrists rather than having to use force. So he does not side with the use of violence and believes that violence is never the appropriate response and peaceful protest is. And he did not denounce the call for law and order. He believes that there should be law and order, but law and order where people are treated with justice. So he has not publicly supported efforts to defund the police. So I want to talk a little bit more of where this conversation around law and order is coming from and how it's been popularized. So scholars in critical prison studies and abolitionist studies, which is where the calls from defund the police, I believe, have been heavily inspired from, point to Barry Goldwater, who was an Arizona senator who ran for president against Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. And during his campaigning, he made these calls to institute law and order in regards to the social crisis that they believed the United States was facing because of all of the protests that were coming from the civil rights movement, efforts to desegregate schools, to desegregate lunch counters. So he felt also that the civil rights movement were heavily linked to communist efforts. So there was this call for law and order that came from Barry Goldwater's campaign. He didn't actually win the presidential seat. Lyndon B. Johnson took it, but this call for law and order and this moral panic around rising crime and social unrest still was left, the society at that moment was left feeling like there was a crisis that needed to be handled and that law and order needed to be instituted. So I'm gonna go ahead and roll a video that could give you a little bit of a sense of what's going on in the early 1960s with the civil rights movement and Barry Goldwater's response to this. So let's see, is it playing?
What I remember most about the 64 campaign was the 64 Civil Rights Act. My dad had been a Republican all his life. And in 64, he switched. And he voted for Johnson and he became a Democrat because Goldwater was against the 64 Civil Rights Act.
Are you concerned perhaps about the Democrats taking advantage of it? After Lyndon Johnson, the biggest faker in the United States, having opposed the Civil Rights Act for all the years of his life, this is the phoniest individual that ever came around. Did you get that?
Lyndon Johnson, a Southern senator who'd long been ambivalent about civil rights legislation, made big efforts to complete an agenda that Kennedy had not been able to complete.
My fellow Americans, I'm about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you.
The 1954 Supreme Court decision against segregation in public schools sent a signal to Black Americans that the highest court in the land had given the seal of approval to what we were fighting for racial integration. Well, with the schools, there was a 10-year period when the country didn't follow through on it.
You have said, I believe, that we have no right to tell the southern states what they must do about school integration. I can't understand this statement. Do you mean to say the Supreme Court decision is null and void? No, the Supreme Court decision is not necessarily the law of the land. The Constitution still is. They interpreted by that action that it was wrong to have segregation. Now, they didn't spell out what was to be done.
Conservatives did not feel that it was something that the federal government should legislate on.
What the president has proposed in this bill is a law which will eliminate one of the most embittering forms of racial discrimination: the denial of free access to places of public accommodation, restaurants, stores, hotels, lunch counters, and other establishments of service or amusement.
I will never vote for a public accommodations clause in any civil rights bill because I think it's unconstitutional. I think it tampers with the rights of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion,
and the freedom of property.
In my home state, we have very few public places that remain segregated by pointing out to business people that it is morally wrong to practice discrimination, and it's also economically bad. This type of approach, while I know it's time consuming, it is having its effect, will have its effect, and I think it will achieve what we want.
Well, like what year? In 1967, in 1979, in 1983? Is it okay during the intervening times that a black kid in a high school baseball team can't stay in a motel?
This is the basic disagreement between the Negro community and Senator Goldwater. They don't think he's prejudiced. They don't think he's a racist. I don't think he's a racist. But they can't go along with a man who says we ought to let what's going on in Mississippi be settled by Mississippi, and the federal government ought to knit or do something else. This we can't take.
On the eve of the convention, 40,000 people, half of them Negroes, demonstrate against Goldwater in the largest civil rights demonstration since the March on Washington last summer.
I am compelled to urge Negroes and all people of goodwill to vote against him. His election would be a tragedy and certainly suicidal almost for the nation and the world.
You know, nobody knows, or none of us knew, what Senator Goldwater's motives were. We had
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out the text. Okay, so I played that video because, I mean, if you've studied this history, maybe you grew up in the era, you're a history buff, you already know. But I find that a lot of students don't actually have a sense of what was going on in the civil rights movement or the types of debates around desegregation and the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, or the way in which civil rights activists were conceptualized. So as you see, it's seen as a federal government meddling into state affairs. And there's also this disdain for those that are advocating for the push of the Civil Rights Act and the efforts to desegregate, because some of them are seen as being meddled with communists, right? So there's a combination of wanting to protect states' rights, but also fearing that those that are engaged in political activism are also working hand in hand with communist efforts. So it combines with the Red Scare of the Cold War, and all of these complaints that are coming forward or criticism of the police are seen as the invention of communists. So what actually came forward with the 1964 Civil Rights Act? It ended segregation in public places such as courthouses, parks, theaters, lunch counters. It banned employment and discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So it wasn't just about desegregating racially, but it was also trying to address a discrimination against women. Lyndon B. Johnson is also known as being, he was the one who signed off the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but he's also known for advancing a series of reforms that try to address poverty, and he's popularly known for the war on poverty. What doesn't get talked about as much is at the same time that he launched the war on poverty, he also launched the war on crime, which actually increased funding for police as a way to restore social order from the feeling that there was a social crisis due to all of this social unrest that was happening, given the various efforts of civil rights activists. So what popularly comes after the war on crime is the 1965 Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And what the 1965 LEAA does is that it actually provides funding to be able to institute a stronger national network to prevent crime. So at that point, it ties local, state, and national efforts for policing. So this is through the LEAA is where they're able to further be able to institutionalize policing and create a stronger network and be able to provide federal resources to provide more training for law enforcement and to develop the institution of policing, like I said, at local, state, and federal levels. So what else comes through LEAA funding is training in local bomb squads, pilot programs for studying alternatives to incarceration. You see funding for drug treatment programs, and you see more funding for the institution of state court organization and training, right? So the nation is developing, and part of with the development of the nation, right? Because the nation is always in making, is trying to institutionalize police. So the way that we understand policing as we do now wasn't always the case. This happened over time, and that big marker for understanding how they're able to provide this huge network for policing is right then and right there. That, like, the war on crime is a pivotal moment. And the war on crime is really important because we have to understand what called for the institutionalization of policing as we know it now, and the funding to be able to develop more techniques for surveillance. It was a direct response for political organizing. It was a response to the civil rights movement, and what would later come through like political third world liberation movements. So when you actually study the history of American police, it's not really the story of democracy or the defending. It's not really about ensuring safety, like, and protecting people's livelihoods or protecting their rights. If anything, it's the story of the prevention of democracy. So we have to see how the growth of the police industry was meant to exterminate those who embodied dissent, and how at that point, part of what was leading to this feeling of social unrest within society, of a social crisis, was that there was also a lot of urban uprisings that were responding to police violence, right? So in '65, you also see the rise of the Watts Rebellion, and you see uprisings in Harlem as well too. So there's this feeling that there's urban crisis and there's a rise in urban crime, and that sense of urban crime is also heavily racialized. So if you read some of the scholars in abolitionist studies, such as Dylan Rodriguez, he actually talks about how the rise of law and order was a campaign for white self-defense, and it was an agenda for white liberation. So the response to be able to provide all of this funding to create a larger network of policing, the desire to quell protests, to fight segregation, to fight communism, was actually an effort to be able to recohere a white supremacist social order. And not just white supremacist, but also white supremacist heteropatriarchal social order. So now we see the call largely to defund the police. But we have to also see that the struggle to be able to defund the police is rooted in years of free, struggles waged by freedom movements. And this movement is not new. So it's heavily inspired by theories around abolition. And to be able to understand that when folks are calling for the defunding of the police, it's about something much larger, right? Which is also calling for the allocation of more funding towards social programs. So the idea is that you defund the police as an institution, and the funds that traditionally go to fund policing would go to other alternatives, right? So making mental health services more accessible, making affordable housing accessible, living wages, making education accessible and affordable, creating liberatory models for learning. So really it's about imagination and reimagining how we think of public safety, or what we think is actually threatening our livelihoods. Is street crime really what we should be containing? How do we actually what do we actually conceptualize this crime? And are those things that we deem crime really what is threatening our livelihoods? Should we be putting more resources and funding into programs that could help create alternative realities, or should that funding be going into policing? So as I explained, abolition is largely about imagination. So part of what abolitionists are trying to talk about as well too is to think about the ways in which toughened crime has limited our imagination, to think about how society's complex problems need to be solved by caging people and incarcerating people. So what if we begin to think of these complex problems that exist in our society, such as drug use, people engaging in theft, and in a much wider sense, and think about what are the root causes that are leading to these things, or are, you know, those types of things that we think traditionally of crime really what is threatening our livelihoods, right? So do we want to think maybe largely more about like environmental racism, the ice caps melting, what is actually threatening our lives? So when people talk about defunding the police, and there are efforts to try to reform the police various police departments, part of what abolitionists talk about is that there's not really a fixing of police. Police cannot be reformed. So often people call for better training or the institution of community policing. And what happens is when you're calling for better training, that's not actually reducing the type of funding or the amount of funding that police receive. If anything, it could become a platform for them to be able to ask for more funding, because they'll need to train more police officers. And community policing is the idea that you go into the community and you talk, you build relationships with people in the community, but you might be building relationships, but it doesn't actually alter the way that we perceive crime, what's threatening our lives. And it could actually lead, again, to them asking for more funding, because then they're gonna say, we need more police to be on foot patrol, and therefore we need a larger budget because we need to hire more police officers. And then there'll be more surveillance and more policing, and it doesn't actually re-articulate the way in which we should be thinking critically about crime. And the narrative, the other narrative that folks provide is, well, there's, like you see also Biden talking about is, well, we need to get rid of the bad apples. And if you actually look at the history of policing, is that this is not about police as individuals, but about the institution of policing. Right, so when you talk about doing assessments and trying to get rid of bad apples, you're still not reducing the funding for police. And the funding for police needs to be liberated in order to be able to invest in alternative programs within our society, right? Or the idea is that they could receive better training in order for them to not use excessive force, and be able to maybe be trained in mental health response, you know, like responses that are more in tune with mental health. In reality, the police should not be handling these situations. So we need to be able to have the funding to be able to actually get alternatives to people calling 911, or alternatives to always, like, our imagination needs to be rewired so that when we have a crisis, our first response is not to call 911, but that there's something else in place that we can lean on, right? So when you say, well, police should be accompanied by a mental health practitioner, the funding is still going through the police department to hire the mental health practitioner. Why do we need the police there? Can the police be called after if necessary? So when people are calling for defunding the police, it's about completely reshaping our society, reshaping the way that we think about crisis, reshaping the way in which funding works, reshaping the way in which we think about public safety, right? And for that, we need to undo our imaginations and our heart from like 30 to 40 years of tough on crime. So in reality, what abolitionists are asking for is the complete restructuring of our society, the way that we think about harm, and the way that we think about addressing issues within our communities. Another very popular conversation that you hear amongst abolitionists is how we should advocate for abolitionist reforms versus reformist reforms. And abolitionist reforms are reforms that get introduced in regards to the criminal justice system that are actually helping us rid ourselves of our dependency our dependency on the police, whereas reformist reforms often are introduced in response to the popularity of critiques of the criminal justice system, but they don't actually help reduce our dependency on the police or on prisons. They actually help expand it, right? So some of those things might be body cameras. So people thinking that situations between police officers and our community are going to improve, or there's going to be less violence because of body cameras. And that actually doesn't understand traditionally why police came to be, or doesn't understand that the excessive force that they use is part of, it's not actually excessive. It's part and parcel of their training. And they could actually turn off cameras at any moment, right? So some of the things that you're seeing now on the ballot here in California is a call to get rid of cash bail. And that actually there has been met with a lot of critiques of how that's actually helping expand incarceration, because you're putting all of the power in the hands of the judges and they're creating a risk assessment. So there needs to be a critique in regards to, well, how do people get labeled as risks, right? Because depending on your zip code, on your neighborhood, on labels that get placed upon you, there has to be a whole critique of like the pre-trial system. And we can't solely rely that the judge is going to actually do the right thing. It doesn't matter if they were appointed by Republicans or Democrats, because of the rise of the prison industrial complex is a bipartisan effort. It wasn't just the Republicans or the Democrats. They have both supported policies that have led to mass incarceration. So when you end cash bail the way that it's being proposed by SB 10, by Proposition 25, you leave it to the judges, and you actually, it's going to lead to a higher expansion of the probation department. So we have to make sure that the reforms that are being introduced are not actually helping expand policing and expand incarceration, but actually, like I said, leading to defunding. So bringing it back to the presidency, when we're talking about the topic of defund the police, neither Trump nor Biden are actually going to support this effort, because Biden's proposal is community policing, and community policing doesn't necessarily lead to the defunding of police. And especially if you're going to leave it in the hands of police officers to self-criticize and fix things within their own department, you can't really have much faith that that's going to happen. So in regards of the topic of defunding the police and the protests that came after the George Floyd murder, that's going to have to continue to be a grassroots effort, and you cannot count on Biden to actually institute the reforms that are going to lead to the defund and the dependency that we now have on the police. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Camacho. I appreciated your presenting the abolitionist position, which we don't see much in the media. And I think it certainly was informative. Our fourth and final speaker is Professor Martin Carcieri, who is Professor of Political Science at San Francisco State. Martin has a BA and MA in philosophy from Cal State LA, and he has a JD from UC Hastings and a PhD in political science in UC Santa Barbara. He teaches and publishes in public law, constitutional law, judicial process, jurisprudence, and political theory, especially American and ancient Greek political theory. He has published several pieces on common law of affirmative action and on the United States drug war. Professor Carcieri.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. You know, I have to say, as I'm listening to my colleagues, that I do agree with an awful lot of what they have to say. And I'm learning a lot along with all of you. So a lot of good stuff here to absorb. You know, let's see. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I don't have any slides for you, and that's either going to be good news or bad news, I guess. But what I want to do is take a slightly different angle, and I'd like to say a bit about the nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court, Judge Amy Coney Barrett. I want to say a little bit about the pending Affordable Care Act case that the Supreme Court's going to hear oral arguments on in a few weeks, and then finish up with some comments on two affirmative action cases that look like they're probably headed to the U.S. Supreme Court in the next couple of years. Okay, so let's see. You know, with respect to Judge Barrett, I've watched these hearings as much as I can with great interest. And I have to say that, first of all, that even if Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell are going down to defeat in the upcoming election, I must say that they're managing to get a third smart young conservative on the Supreme Court is about as much as Republicans and conservatives could have hoped for from them. So if Judge Barrett is confirmed to the US Supreme Court and the Democrats take control of both the presidency and Congress, you know, there will be a new dynamic going forward, a real shift, a real alignment, as we say in politics, right? So for example, within a couple of years, Roe v. Wade is overturned, which looks like a real possibility. Well, at that point, Congress will be free and will have an incentive to do what a lot of people wish Congress had done in the late 60s or early 70s, which is to enact a federal law guaranteeing the right to abortion, at least in the time, place, and manner limited way that abortion is protected now. That would have been preferable, a lot of people think, to leaving the issue either to the states or to the US Supreme Court. And keep in mind on that point, Roe v. Wade, even if you're pro-choice as a policy matter the way that I am, not only does the word abortion not appear in the US Constitution, but the word privacy does not appear there as well. So if we're trying to be at all objective about this, I think it must be admitted that Roe v. Wade, even if you agree with the policy that it wound up protecting, is a bit of a stretch of the constitutional text. And on that account, a lot of people have opposed it. So anyway, stay tuned on that one. It's going to take a few years for that to play out, but I don't have much doubt that Amy Coney Barrett, if she were on the court, would agree that Roe v. Wade should be torn up root and branch, and then we'd have to go from there. Okay. Now, it also happens to turn to the Affordable Care Act. Let's just say a little bit about that. That's the case on that is going to be argued in a couple of weeks. I'll come back to that. So let me back up on that. A lot of you will recall that in 2012, in a case called Sebelius versus NFIB, National Federation of Independent Businesses, Chief Justice John Roberts held for a 5-4 majority on the court that the Affordable Care Act was a constitutional exercise of congressional power under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Now, while the court held that the individual mandate in that law was beyond Congress's power under the Commerce Clause, it upheld the ACA under Congress's taxing power. And the first thing to note here is that Judge Barrett, a few years ago, criticized that ruling as not the most honest interpretation of the taxing power. So if Barrett is confirmed, there's going to be a little bit of awkwardness between her and the Chief Justice on that. But anyway, now fast forward to 2017, Congress repealed the key part of the Affordable Care Act called the individual mandate, which is a requirement that every individual pay some measure toward their health care. Now, let's see. In the most recent case, again, the one I'm talking about that'll be argued in a couple of weeks, Texas versus California, the lower court, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, held that as a result of Congress repealing the individual mandate, well, there's no longer a basis for Congress's taxing power to enact that law. If there's no longer a penalty, an individual mandate, there's nothing that seems to function like a tax. And so again, I think that there's a good chance that the Affordable Care Act may be struck down in its current form. And again, that is something that perhaps Justice Barrett may agree to. Again, on November 10th, in just 1 week after the election, the US Supreme Court will hear arguments in this case. Again, it's called Texas versus California. And again, I can imagine Judge Barrett agreeing that since the law no longer mandates anything that can be considered a tax, it is unconstitutional even under the taxing power. There's another issue that I don't want to say much about, but it's whether the rest of the law is severable, can be separated from the individual mandate. And on that issue, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals remanded the case back down to the lower court for further analysis. And so we'll see how that all shakes out. So stay tuned on that as well, looking forward. Okay, so then I want to come to the issue I want to spend the most time on here, affirmative action. I'm also going to say that there's a good chance that this is on the chopping block, especially if Judge Barrett is confirmed. Now, just to clear the ground a little bit, we have to be clear that the term affirmative action is a very vague term. The word affirmative means not negative, and the word action covers a lot of ground. It's interesting to note that where that phrase came from, so far as my research has shown, it goes back to an executive order in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy. And in that executive order, establishing the contractor, talking about people who, general contractors who assign subcontracts to different firms, some of which are minority owned and some of which are not. The executive order declared that, the contractor will take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during their employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. So do you see that? When the term affirmative action was first used, it was specifically and clearly to ensure non-discrimination against any person based on race, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. And yet, by contrast, these days, the term affirmative action, even though I'm saying it's a very vague term, often refers to something far more than non-discrimination against any person. So there's one difficulty with it. And again, in general, I'm going to say, and I'm glad to come back to this later, I'm going to submit that we get nowhere in serious policy, legal, or constitutional analysis of affirmative action unless we specify the means of affirmative action, the ends of affirmative action, the context of affirmative action, and who the favored and disfavored groups are to be. I'm going to say that the word affirmative action, therefore, can be used correctly only when we intend to be vague, which often humans want to do quite legitimately. If I ask you, do you like food? Well, yeah, some food, not all of it, right? So again, you see there's part of the difficulty there. That's why I tend in my work and in my publications on this, not to use that term because it really doesn't specify much of anything. All right. So again, with that understanding, I'm going to say that in general, there appear to be a couple of cases probably headed to the US Supreme Court in the next couple of years. One is a constitutional case and the other is simply a statutory case, right? That doesn't involve any constitutional issues. So one of them that you probably heard about because it's already been heard by a federal district court is Asian Americans versus Harvard. And this was an attack on the way that Harvard University, its admissions practices. Now, again, Harvard is a private institution. It's not governed by the Constitution, but it is governed by Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which requires that any institution that accepts federal funding, and virtually every university does, shall not discriminate against any person based on race, gender, ethnicity, et cetera, in terms of opportunities there. So now the federal district court has ruled so far in favor of Harvard. And of course, the case is going to be on appeal now to the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Boston. Whatever the ruling there, I think it's a safe bet that there will be a request for the US Supreme Court to review that case. And I'm thinking whether or not Barrett is confirmed, I'm thinking there's a good chance that the US Supreme Court will take up that case. And so keep that in mind. I'm saying that's one of the cases likely headed to the US Supreme Court. The other case likely headed to the Supreme Court is not even a lawsuit yet, but I'm predicting that as a result of the Proposition 16 in California, which I'm sure a lot of you know is a California ballot initiative. Proposition 16 is designed to repeal Proposition 209. Proposition 209 was approved as a citizens ballot initiative in 1996, and it's now Article 1, Section 31 of the California Constitution. In this political climate, I'm predicting there's a very good chance that Proposition 16 will be approved. At that point, I'm thinking there's a very good chance that there will be a challenge to that repeal of non-discrimination to the US Supreme Court under the 14th Amendment. So again, it's going to take a couple of years for this to work. I mean, it's not even a lawsuit yet, never mind gotten to the federal trial court, never mind the federal appellate court. and up to the US Supreme Court. This process takes a while. So here's the thing that I want to say about that. Now that we've got those two cases in front of us, I submit to you that a recent ruling over the summer of 2020 by the US Supreme Court sends a very strong signal with regard to how this court will rule on those two cases when they come up. The case I'm talking about, and I'll tell you a little bit about, is called Bostock versus Clayton County. Bostock, B-O-S-T-O-C-K versus Clayton County. In this case, the Title VII civil rights case. You're already experts on that because Professor Camacho told you about that. It's a good law that I personally support. Bostock is a Title VII case. And in this case, believe it or not, Justice Gorsuch sided with Justices Kagan, Breyer, Ginsburg, and Sotomayor. And he even wrote the controlling opinion in this case. So let's see. In Bostock, Justice Gorsuch for the court held that Title VII, which bans sex discrimination against any person in the terms of private employment, prohibits employers from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation in the terms of employment. So let me say that again. In Bostock, the court held, Justice Gorsuch for the court, held that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which bans discrimination against any person based on race, gender, ethnicity, and so forth, prohibits employers from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation in the terms of employment. And again, Gorsuch was with the liberals on this one. So that's kind of interesting and maybe unexpected. I'm also going to say that Justice Gorsuch wrote a very powerful, lucid, well-reasoned opinion. He emphasized at length that it is the individual person and no racial, ethnic, or gender group that is protected fully and explicitly by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we have to be very clear about that, folks. I'm not saying that tells us what the result of every lawsuit should be, but we must be clear that like the 14th Amendment, due process, and equal protection clauses, the 1964 Civil Rights Act explicitly protects the individual person. It's a quintessential liberal value. The individual is the locus of civil rights. Not only some groups are protected. So I predict that insofar as Justice Gorsuch embraces and writes a very lucid, powerful opinion along these lines, that it is the individual person who is fully protected, I'm thinking that there's a very good chance that he and a few other members of the Supreme Court, if and when they hear these, the Harvard case and the Prop 16 case, that will be a guideline for them, right? If, for example, with respect to Proposition 16, the California Solicitor General takes up the case and argues it, before the U.S. Supreme Court, the California Solicitor General is going to have an uphill battle defending Proposition 16 against 14th Amendment attack. After all, with Proposition 16, Californians, if they approve it, would literally be voting against, that is to say, repealing non-discrimination. Prop 209 explicitly commanded non-discrimination against any person based on race, gender, ethnicity in the allocation of public benefits, like public contracts, public university seats, and public employment. So that's going to be awfully hard to defend. Again, Californians will literally be repealing non-discrimination. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Let me just add one other thing here. I may not take the full 20 minutes like my colleagues, but I think we want to get to some questions here. Whatever else you think of Justice Gorsuch, I'm here to tell you he is a brilliant legal mind. First of all, he was on the Harvard Law Review, and he clerked at the U.S. Supreme Court for Justice Anthony Kennedy. Every year, there's only about 30 U.S. Supreme Court law clerks. So that's about as distinguished as you can get in this line of work, to be selected to be a U.S. Supreme Court law clerk. And at that point, he still had not had enough abuse. At that point, he goes on to take a PhD from Oxford University in England. And he happened to write his doctoral dissertation on the issue of the right to die. Now, this is an issue, just as an aside here, in which I have great interest. In fact, the book that I published about 5 years ago on John Rawls one of my chapters, I argued that Rawlsian principles of justice will support a time, place, manner, limited right to die. Justice Gorsuch, by contrast, in his dissertation argued systematically against a right to die, coming from a very conservative approach. And I read it carefully. I was truly impressed with the quality of his legal analysis, and I think he is as wrong as he can be. I'm up in my late 30s now, and so I'm kind of pivoting toward potential retirement here before too long. And I must say, one of the things that I may do in retirement is write a systematic critique of Justice Gorsuch's dissertation. It would take 2 or 3 years to do it because it is such a thorough, powerful argument. But again, I think it's dead wrong. So my only point about that is that you should know that going forward with Justice Gorsuch, he is about as fine a legal mind as you can find. If he's a first-rate legal mind, I will be proud to be called second-rate. And he's going to be on that court perhaps for a long time, so you should just know that this is what we can expect. And again, I suggest if you're interested, go read his controlling opinion in Bostock v. Clayton County. Again, it's about as powerful and well-reasoned an argument as I've ever seen. And so let me leave it there. I got some other things that I can say, but I think we want to move on, and I'd like to hear more from my colleagues. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Marty. I really appreciated predictions about the court. We don't often see that, but I know it'll be of interest to the viewers of this webinar going forward to see what happens to the court. Given the time we have, I think we can only do one question per person. So per speaker, I will look at the question. Let's see. Ron, how about this question? How will preventing the growth of the economy and wages help the common man? I don't know if you were advocating the prevention of the growth of the economy. How would you relate what you were talking about to the growth of the economy?
Well, it would, maybe the person was thinking that if we were to tax the rich and buttress worker rights, that would inhibit growth in the economy and lead to bad outcomes. I'm actually arguing the opposite. It's more of a sort of New Deal approach, I guess, that argues that the economic growth could be maintained, the product would be more shared. In contrast to, the commie pinkos that Angelica was referring to, but certainly those folks that argue for democratic socialism would argue for much more strong restructuring, which I have great sympathy for as well.
Okay, let's go to Nick. There seems to be a question about the Second Amendment as regards to gun rights. Can you relate your comments to the Second Amendment?
I'll try. The court has pronounced that you have a Second Amendment right to own a handgun for the purposes of self-defense in 2 decisions, in the Heller case, which applied it to DC, and then the McDonald versus Chicago case, which applied it through the Due Process Clause to the states. In terms of involving policing, I'm not so sure of the connect there between the two. I suppose on one level, I'll put it this way. A lot of people don't know this, but the common law rule is actually that you do not have a right to resist an unlawful arrest, but you actually do have a right to resist the use of excessive force by a police officer or a constable against you. And in fact, it's actually built in to, as an affirmative defense, into the California Penal Code. So if you are accused of fighting with a police officer, you actually do have an affirmative defense to suggest that you were trying to stop an excessive use of force against you. I suppose you could up the ante and involve guns in that situation. Although what I always tell my students is if you're going to take a swing at a police officer, you better be sure that you win the fight. And you better be sure that you're not convicted afterwards when they do finally track you down. So the better tactic is usually not to resist and then to file your lawsuit after the fact, which of course you would do with a 1983 lawsuit, right, for excessive use of force or a false arrest. So I suppose maybe that's a connection between those two in some limited sense.
Okay, thanks. Professor Camacho, there seems to be someone asked a question using the phrase self-policing. If the police were defunded, who will deal with the function of policing? And does the term self-policing mean anything to you?
Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean by self-policing, if that means like communities taking control and regulating themselves. Would that be what it means?
Well, let's go to the other question, which may be clearer. If the police are defunded, there'll be a gap, and how will that gap be, in your mind, best filled?
Well, it depends on it depends on what people are responding to, right? So the idea is that if people have more access to social services, right? If they have access to living wages, if they have access to affordable housing, if they have access to food, if they have access to, if there was a different infrastructure within our society, there wouldn't be that much crime or what people consider street crime, right? Or that there's different methods in which we could be addressing the way in which instances that people deem harmful, right? So there's different methods of accountability, whether that be like a restorative justice process or, so it depends on the case, right? So like if we're thinking about the case of domestic violence, the idea would be like, instead of investing money in policing as a way to address domestic violence, why don't we actually have more resources to be able to build like houses for women so that they can, or men, if they're victims of domestic violence, so that domestic violence survivors have somewhere to go, right? Or why don't we actually invest in like mental health or therapy models that help victims come to a sense of self-worth so that they themselves can walk away from abusive relationships. Or sometimes people stay in relationships because they're dependent on the abuser for like their survival, right? So there's only one wage earner within the household that provides, like there's one main provider, and the person has a dependent relationship with the abuser. So sometimes they will stay. So that's where I was speaking about, like we respond to our society's complex problems by caging people. Incarcerating people has become the easy solution to very complex problems. So part of why I said that abolition is about imagination, it's because abolition requires us to have these really tough conversations where we actually, in Spanish you say this, menuzar, but you unpack and you see all of the pieces of what's making those things that you identify as harmful, right? So when we talk about domestic violence, the quick response is call 911, right? But we don't actually think about developing an infrastructure that would help people leave abusive situations, right? Or we don't address like sexism, right? So we think about policing as a response to domestic violence, but then we don't do anything about heteropatriarchy, right? So like, what is our society, or what are the resources that exist within our society to be able to undo sexism, to be able to undo heterosexism, right? And that requires a huge cultural shift. So what happens when all of our energy goes into policing is that we don't ask these questions, right? So yeah, I had to do a really quick overview of abolition, but it requires deep conversations. It requires us sitting down and going back and forth in dialogue and imagining otherwise. And that's why, so I think somebody felt that I was perhaps being biased. You know, what I was trying to give to you is really, I was trying to contextualize it within the conversation of law and order in this presidential debate for you to understand that the popularization of law and order comes all the way back, right? And part of it is rooted to what then gives birth to these tough on crime approaches that end up leading us to think that caging people is a solution, right? So where is it coming from? And it's a backlash to the civil rights movement and all of these third world liberation movements that have had a different way of visualizing us living as a society, right? Whether that be anti-war, free love, feminist movements, queer movements, anti-racist movements, anti-capitalist movement. Like our nation was in crisis because it was being forced to completely reinvent itself, reinvent how we thought of being in community with each other, of how we related to one another, who was going to be the breadwinner, and like it was completely reshaping our concept of family, of love, of sex. So yeah, the nation was in crisis, and it was having to let go of a lot of these traditional roles or ways of perceiving one another that were harmful, that were violent, right? So when Trump or Biden say we don't support violence, the only way is a peaceful path, well, what do you say to the nation pre-1965 when the foundation of this country is genocide and slavery? This country is founded on violence. And when we respond with police repression, that is also violence. That is violence. It's just on a side that is, I guess, in some ways legally protected, right? And you can lean on the Constitution, you can lean on all these policies, but when you're arrested and then you're in court, if you can't afford to like have an attorney, it doesn't matter what the Constitution says, because then you're leaning on a public defender, on the public defender's office who's like swamped, right? So not everyone has the right to be protected in the Constitution in the same way. Like that has to do a lot with like access to wealth and resources, right? So it's about, abolition would be about redistributing resources in one way. That's one aspect. So in regards to defunding the police, we're saying you have to think about like defunding the police so that we can begin to invest in other aspects in our society.
Okay, I think you made that clear that in a society where there is inequality, there needs to be redistribution or reallocation, as you say. And one way to get that reallocation is to obtain funds that are now going in one direction to serve other purposes.
And I think that that would be the beginning, because you can stop the police, but the policing is not just an institution. It's something that's also embedded in our imagination and in our hearts and the way that we approach one another, right? So it wouldn't be enough to finish with the institution of policing. It would have to be creating a whole different sociality.
Okay. I think there are many people, especially in this webinar, in dealing with issues, who have come to that conclusion that fundamental change is necessary. And I think you're certainly in line with those comments. One last question before we adjourn. And Professor Carcieri, we have a question on Roe versus Wade. If Roe versus Wade was overturned, could not the Democratic Congress and White House pass another law to protect abortion?
Yes, absolutely. I referenced that just in passing. Surely, yeah, they have the power to do that. Congress could easily rely on its commerce power because in the aggregate, all the activity related to abortion certainly impacts interstate commerce. So the constitutional authority for Congress to pass a federal law protecting the basic right to abortion, there would certainly be limits on it, right? But yeah, and again, as I mentioned just in passing, a lot of people think it would have been a great thing if Congress could have stepped up in the late 60s, early 70s and done exactly that. But it didn't, and as a result, the court decided to step up and accept a case like Roe v. Wade, and there it is. So
let me use my limited American government knowledge. If a law like that were passed, wouldn't it be challenged legally, and it would come back to the same Supreme Court that overturned it in the first place?
Well, that overturned it in the first place. I'm not quite following that.
Well, if the court overturns Roe versus Wade, wouldn't another law be susceptible to the same overturning by the court?
Okay. I think Congress would be in much better position to have that law upheld again, because Congress would have authority under the Commerce Clause to do that. And so, yeah, I agree with those who think that this should have a legislative solution. And I don't think that the court, I'm trying to think now, the court, again, there would be no problem with Congress's constitutional authority to pass such a law.
I see. So you think the legislative basis of the right to abortion is more strong than another court's decision?
Yeah, I think the U.S. Supreme Court would be in a very different position with respect to an act of Congress that creates that right. Now, again, I think that right would have to be time, place, manner limited in some ways, right? I can't imagine even the most left-wing Congress creating a federal law, creating a right to abortion up to the point of birth. So I think, for example, a federal law would probably include something like a woman has the right, presumptively, if she's of sufficient age and so forth, to have to get an abortion up to the point of viability, the line that the court drew in Roe v. Wade, which is the point at which the fetus could live outside the mother. So I don't think Congress would have any problem establishing a federal statutory right, limited right, to get an abortion, and a right that would more or less track what Roe and some of the later cases have allowed. So, yeah, and I think it would recognize that Congress is well within its power to do that, and that is where a policy like this should be enacted. And in that way, I mean, any states that try to ban the right to abortion would lose, because Congress, federal law preempts contrary state law, especially where federal law is establishing a right that the states try to take away. So I'm pretty, Nick can answer this as well as I can, but I think if Congress had the political will to enact a law like this, I don't think the U.S. Supreme Court would have a way to strike it down. So we'll see. I mean, again, I see a parallel between 2020 and 1932, when there was suddenly a Democratic president and Democratic control of Congress. Now that's only an opening, a possibility, but that might be the kind of thing that could be done, along with repealing the Trump-McConnell tax cut and so forth. So
okay,
very promising.
Nick, can I turn to you to comment on what we just talked about in 30 seconds?
I'm not as hopeful as Marty. I think that a federal statute would be able to protect the right to travel, like to have an abortion, for instance. You would not be able to shut down abortion clinics, for example, but I don't know that it would be as strong as a constitutional right to an abortion. And so I still think that there would be roadblocks consistent with, as Marty says, a time, place, or manner restriction that would still limit it, particularly in some states more than others, just by virtue of the lack of clinics, for example, that those places have. It would take a step that would recover a little that is lost after Roe versus Wade. It would not replace Roe versus Wade on a constitutional level.
Okay.
I did not express hope.
I'm sorry, Marty. We've gone over time, and even though we have more leverage than the typical news outlet when they have to end for all kinds of reasons, I don't want to impose on the viewers more than our 5:40 end time. So let me use the last moments here to thank Professors Carcieri, Camacho, Conway, and Hayduk for a very informative and lively session. I want to thank you all for dealing with these difficult issues in ways that I think illuminated our understanding. And I know they certainly helped me understand issues. To the viewers, next week we make a big change and we move to foreign affairs. And next week we will talk about Russia, China, and Iran with experts on those countries and relations to the United States. So see you next week, and thank you very much for our wonderful panel this afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.